Well, hello there. Welcome to the Quadruple D. We have quite an episode here. I'm going to start off by talking about gerrymandering news in California and Texas. And I'm also going to look at Trump Saudi ties a little bit, and also the history of Saudi Arabia, or parts of it anyway. So, starting off, when the California Supreme Court dismissed the GOP's effort to delay legislative redistricting, it cleared the path for Democrats to push ahead with their countermeasures against Texas's partisan map. Four Republican lawmakers argued the plan violated a constitutional rule requiring a 30-day public review, but the court found they did not meet the legal threshold for relief. On another front, Texas Republicans, responding to pressure from Donald Trump and Governor Greg Abbott, passed a mid decade congressional map aimed at securing five additional GOP leaning seats ahead of the 2026 midterms. Despite Democratic walkouts and protests, this included a weeks long absence by over 50 state legislators. The House still approved the bill in an 88 to 52, let me repeat that, 88 to 52 party line vote. So the Democrats condemned the map for infringing upon voting rights and undermining fair representation, pointing to tactics like cracking and packing, which dilute the voting strength of Black and Hispanic communities, even as Republicans defended their plan by citing Supreme Court precedent, Rucho versus Common Cause, and claimed it enhances minority majority districts. So, yeah, that's the ongoing fight um, over who has the legitimate legal claim in there. But it sounds like the courts are going to most likely side with the gerrymandering because the courts are largely right wing in Texas and of course the United States Supreme Court. In Sacramento, California's Democratic leadership is engineering its own redistricting initiative dubbed the Election Rigging Response Act, with the suggestion there that yes, they know it's questionable what they're doing, but it's a response to what Texas is doing. So if Texas is going to rig the election in favor of Republicans, then it's only fair that the Democrats rig their elections in favor of the Democrats. And it would the initiative would temporarily override the Independent Redistricting Commission. If passed, and it actually does sound like it will pass, but it would redraw maps to potentially flip five Republican held districts to Democratic control, subject to voter approval in a November special election. So I just want to be clear about my position here. I mean, you can side with me on this or not, but I think there's justification for what they're doing in California because they're just using the Republican strategy against them. They're basically just playing with the new set of rules that that the Republican Party has already established elsewhere. So it makes sense. It's similar to I consider myself as a pacifist, almost a borderline pacifist. I don't go around hacking people up with an axe or something like that, right? But if there's somebody coming after me with an axe, I might just let my pacifist side slip, and maybe I'll use that axe against the person who's attacking me. And the same argument could be made, you know, uh, roughly transposed over into this issue. You use the attacker's weapons against them. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I'm not personally against this, but I am going to look at some of the, in my opinion, still valid critiques of this whole, I guess, mess. And, it's democracy distorted by state power in many ways. So I often do this on this podcast. I look at how the news is sort of validating the anarchist critiques of power. So in this case, from an anarchist viewpoint, they would say that both parties' strategies deepen the corruption of democracy by weaponizing state machinery. And that's actually what is happening here. Gerrymandering by design, whether in Texas or California, demonstrates how political elites uphold power while dismantling participatory governance, at least in many ways. So you've got, I mean, really legitimacy versus democracy in some ways here. So both the Republican and Democratic moves bypass grassroots participation, replacing it with manipulative top-down engineering of representation. So it's like a fake sort of democracy. It's an engineered from the top form of democracy, and it's it's just a blurring of the lines between uh, truly representative government and stacking the uh, odds and the favor of one side or the other. Just playing sort of a rigged game. And the specter of mutual legitimization is there too. So when Democrats respond to GOP gerrymanders by launching their own, they actually sort of validate the system, the new rules of the system, if you will, reinforcing the idea that legitimacy can be bought through manipulation and not actual consensus. Because again, it's not that I even 100% oppose what the Democrats are doing, but it's obviously a manipulation, and to be fair, they are acknowledging that while they are acknowledging that it's what's happening in Texas as well. And you have structural inertia being favored over genuine alternatives. So instead of dismantling this corrupt, centralized power or empowering communities of people, this redistricting cycle merely reallocates control within the same framework. It's definitely not the sort of revolutionary change that people need in order to vastly improve their lives. It it uh, it definitely is a potentially valid short term win if the the redistricting in California can sort of prevent what they're doing in Texas from truly taking away the Democratic edge or what have you. Because keep in mind, the Republican Party is overtly a fascist party at this point. They're whittling away people's rights all over the place, and like lately, Trump is actually trying to say that museums shouldn't be able to criticize slavery and stuff like that. And you have Pete Hegseth, who is a right wing lunatic. He's a religious fanatic. He actually shared on social media some posts by some pastors or whatever they're called, religious quacks, religious loons, who say that women should not have the right to vote. And keep in mind, that's Pete Hegseth. He is the Secretary of Defense, which is a word we should use loosely. He's a very powerful person sharing the message that women should not be allowed to vote. So think about that, and you can get back to me on whether the Democrats have a right to sort of borrow the methods of the Texas Republicans. I think they do, although I do understand the criticisms. And, it's still true that more, I guess, deeper transformation would involve devolving decision making to assemblies or cooperatives, not redrawing lines based on partisan calculations, but having more of a direct democracy. That's what I want personally. So, sort of a large cooperative full of cooperatives, basically. And, until we get that as a country, we're going to have a lot of, partisanship moves toward fascism. And, hopefully the overtly fascistic movement gets defeated, but, the partisanship is going to remain in any case, and obviously the fascist elements could come roaring back at any minute. So, for further context, a Reuters Ipsos poll showed that 55% of Americans, including most Democrats and nearly half of Republicans, agree that these redistricting pushes are bad for democracy, with 57% fearing U.S. democracy itself is in peril. Now, why these Republicans who fear democracy being in peril would actually still favor Donald Trump, I have no idea. He's putting the military in the streets of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. It's obvious that he doesn't care about democracy. He's trying to normalize weaponizing the U.S. military against its own citizens. That's an obvious sign of authoritarianism, sort of with the training wheels still on. But of course, he's getting closer to taking those training wheels off. This is him sort of testing the grounds, and that's why at this moment you do kind of have to. I don't know about throughout the rule book entirely, but you have to like skip a few pages here and there because these Republicans they do not care at all about law and order. I know that's something that they say they care about, but obviously they don't. Remember, some years back, Trump said that we should terminate the U.S. Constitution if it prevents him from getting back in power. He said that on his stupid Truth Social uh, anti-social media network. And if you don't believe me about that, you can still find the post. He never deleted it, I don't think. So you should still be able to find that over there if you just do a search. Anyway, legal challenges are expected on both fronts. Democrats plan to fight the Texas map under the Voting Rights Act. California Republicans vow to continue pursuing their case through courts and electoral mobilization. So in Texas, the GOP, that's Abbott, and the legislature, they passed this mid decade redistricting for plus 5 GOP seats. It had Senate approval and governor signatures pending. If I don't know when it's supposed to be signed, but he might be signing that very soon. And of course, you got the legal fights that are expected. And in California, the Democratic legislature is seeking to redraw districts to counter Texas and flip seats in their own way. And the Supreme Court of California allowed it, and there is supposed to be a special election to follow. So, all right, let's move on to the second segment of this show within a show, and this segment is called the Peripheral Poophead of the Week. And this time we're looking at Fahd of Saudi Arabia. So he's got ties to Trump, and this is because obviously we're living in authoritarian times. So I want to talk about one of the clearest signs that Trump and frankly a lot of elements of this country have authoritarian tendencies. So in early 1985, on February 11th, a Washington state dinner unfolded in the Blue Room of the White House. President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan greeted a line of distinguished guests, including Donald and Ivana Trump as they hosted King Fahd of Saudi Arabia as the guest of honor. Well, imagine that. Of course, what's funny about that is that Trump would go on to sort of be a major Islamophobe. He was talking about banning all Muslims from entering the United States, yet he has this tie or these ties to Saudi Arabia. Isn't that a little bit quaint? So obviously this goes all the way back to 1985, so it's not even like a recent phenomenon. And you have to wonder, why is that? Well, I'm going to get into this a little bit deeper here. This encounter, though seemingly ceremonial, really symbolized intricate power dynamics. The United States reinforcing ties with an autocratic regime, and the Trumps, then private citizens, borrowing prestige through proximity to power. And that there's this sort of myth that Donald Trump is the ultimate outsider or something, but why would an outsider be attending this Washington state dinner at the White House with the president, his wife, Nancy Reagan as well, and also the King of Saudi Arabia? Does that really sound like somebody who's an outsider? That sounds like somebody who was very much inside and well before he ever ran for president. This sounds like somebody who was deeply embedded in the corridors of power even before he technically was. He was a well-known presence because he was close to these wealthy and powerful figures. So this is just a critical snapshot, but I'm going to take a look at King Fahd's rise and legacy. So, Fahd bin Abdulaziz Al Saud was born in Riyadh in the early 1920s. I don't know exactly when. They say it's either 1920, 1921, or 1923, but it was into the royal lineage founded by King Abdulaziz. And I'll talk a little bit more about him a little bit later on in the third segment. But King Fahd's, you know, his rise was interesting. He emerged as the eldest among, uh, I guess, seven sons, and he grew up steeped in both privilege and political grooming. And his education, he received his early schooling in the specially established Prince's School in Riyadh, then pursued religious studies in Mecca, training that merged conservative Islam with statecraft. Again, why is Trump associated with somebody who's an Islamic theocrat? Why was he attending the state dinner? Why is he brushing elbows with these people that he claims to hate so much? Again, threatening to block all Muslims from entering the United States, yet he's in bed with the royal family. And by 1953, King Fahd was appointed Saudi Arabia's first minister of education. Well, this was before he was king, I should say. And he did initiate public schooling expansion, which could be seen as a good thing, including for women, though still framed within state theocratic control. And his later tenure as Minister of Interior from 1962 to 1975 sort of solidified his role over internal security and surveillance as a state apparatus. So, he was the crown prince and de facto leader. Following King Faisal's assassination in March 1975, and amid King Khalid's failing health, Fahd was elevated to crown prince. From that vantage, he held the reins of power long before officially becoming king in 1982. And the reign was, you know, he ascended to the throne in June 1982. Fahd became Saudi Arabia's longest serving monarch until his death in 2005. He championed the 1992 Basic Law, the kingdom's constitutional like framework, enshrining religious authority and securing dynastic power while delivering an illusion of legal cover. So theocracy, in other words, and what do you know? What's something that the Republican Party seems hell bent on doing right now? Establishing theocracy, and that seems like if Trump was hanging around with you know theocrats and dictators and aspiring to be like them, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe he's aspiring to have such a thing over here himself. And I want people out there to remember that, you know, a theocracy doesn't necessarily mean that the people in charge actually even believe in the religion. Because if you look at Mussolini, the Italian dictator, he actually early on was apparently an avowed atheist, yet he cynically later on would cling to religious bullcrap in order to consolidate power and become a fascist dictator. So it's very possible that Mussolini never actually truly believed any sort of religious teachings or anything like that, but he cynically used that as a cudgel against the population and as a propaganda tool. Because if you have God on your side, well, then how dare you question the dear leader? And I'm not sure how that works in North Korea. They seem to think that the leader over there is like a god. The sort of the sort of stereotype is that they don't even think that the leaders in Saudi, or not Saudi Arabia, in North Korea even have bodily functions and stuff like that. So, that's an interesting variation on it to, make the king or whatever the honorary title is, as if they are the deity itself, or himself, or I suppose in some cases maybe herself. But anyway, moving on. There were controversies and constraints in the leadership here. During the 1990 Gulf War, FAD opened Saudi soil to U.S. led coalition forces to confront Iraq. Though strategically significant, this move sparked domestic backlash and illustrated how oil and strategic dependence can override sovereignty, even for conservative monarchs. And a debilitating stroke in 1995 left him largely sidelined, with Crown Prince Abdullah acting as regent and eventually succeeding him in 2005. So, we're going to look at this from a bit of a critical lens when it comes to the power, performance, and acquiescence. From my critical standpoint, or maybe a critical standpoint in general, the 1985 state dinner wasn't just ceremonial, it was an orchestrated affirmation of global elite networks. The Trumps, though not yet central political actors, were staking symbolic claims to status by associating with Reagan's administration and an absolute monarchy. So, such events reveal how legitimacy is conferred through ritual, some degree of apparent consent, and of course, spectacle. You got a nice dinner with all of these elite figures who really actually do terrible things, but in the name of freedom and salvation and all that garbage. So, King Fahd's rule, it demonstrates the intertwining of religious authority and state power codified through basic law, or the basic law as it was called, but always maintained within stratified hierarchical structures. The king will never want to be anything but a king once their rule is established, at least with maybe only the rarest of exceptions. They're sort of glued to their hierarchical structure, and they will not see people as anything other than just the subjects to be ruled, or what have you. However they see them, maybe ants to be stepped on or something. And his use of internal repression, surveillance, and external alliances, like hosting US troops, highlights how modern statecraft ultimately sustains ruling classes and restricts grassroots sovereignty. So that's another thing they would not want in Saudi Arabia is like an actual grassroots movement for independence from the Saudi royal family. That they don't want that. So they're going to crush any such efforts. And I suppose if you're raised in such a society, it's understandable that they would crush those efforts. But if you're an outsider and people are just demanding freedom and democracy and rights, and Saudi Arabia is one of the worst human rights abusers in the world. So the grassroots stuff, it makes sense, but it also makes sense that if you're propagandized against such efforts, well, you're going to be loyal to the royal family. And even his educational reforms, expanding public schooling, did little to dismantle power. Rather, they served to manufacture consent and produce compliant citizens. The Basic Law, rather than liberation, anchored legitimacy in divine authority and dynastic rule, tightly circumscribing political participation. So, think about that 1985 state dinner that Reagan hosted that featured King Fahd as the featured honorary guest, the main special feature. Well, the Trumps attended that. It was a ritual of elite networking and symbolic legitimization. Fahd's rise, he was born in the early 20s. He was educated, he held ministerial roles, and became king in 1982. Well, again, who else wants to be like a king nowadays? Well, you can figure out who I'm talking about. And you had power entrenched through dynastic privilege and state apparatus or apparatuses. I don't know how the plural of that word is, but the Basic Law of 1992 formalized governance foundation within Islamic dynastic terms. So I expect the Trump administration to have something similar to the Basic Law of 1992. They're going to have, like, instead of a instead of an Islamic dynastic system, they're going to try to have a Christian dynastic system that, of course, will serve billionaires and multimillionaires as well. And the pattern here is that they consolidate hierarchical rule under religious veneers. The Gulf War decision was also pretty eye-opening. They opened up for U.S. troops, even though it was criticized domestically. It was state sovereignty compromised by reliance on external imperial power, and the succession maintained dynasty continuity and authoritarian stability, and that's what these types of people want. They want to have that as their legacy. All right, looking at King Abdulaziz as promised as the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. He's also known as Ibn Saud. So, the biggest scandal involving Ibn Saud, Abdulaziz Ibn Saud, he lived from 1875 to 1953. He was the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, was involved in many controversies, but the biggest scandal historically is his massacre and betrayal of the Ikhwan. That's spelled like Ikhwan. They were a Wahhabi tribal militia, and this happened in the late 1920s. So, for the context here, the Ikhwan were the fanatical Bedouin warriors who powered Ibn Saud's conquests. They enforced Wahhabi doctrine through terror. That's raids, forced conversions, destruction of shrines, and mass killings. All that fun stuff. So the scandal, you know, once Ibn Saud consolidated power and wanted to modernize and cut deals with Britain, that's oil, borders, and arms, the Ikhwan resisted. They wanted endless jihad against neighboring lands like Iraq, Kuwait, and Jordan, and they despised the compromises that Ibn Saud made with Western imperial powers. So, what was the outcome of that? In 1929, Ibn Saud turned on them at the Battle of, I believe this is pronounced Sabila. His machine guns, provided by Britain, slaughtered the very Ikhwan who had built his kingdom. This was both a political purge and an act of ruthless realpolitik. Other scandals exist, like his role in cutting deals with Britain and the U.S. oil companies, extreme repression of dissent, and secret assassinations, and so on and so forth. But the Ikhwan massacre is the most glaring betrayal that shaped the authoritarian DNA of Saudi Arabia. So, quite often when I look at these stories, again, I look at it sort of from how do these people in power actually validate anarchist perspectives and anarchist critiques of power? Because we're supposed to view anarchists as clowns and radicals and weirdos, but very often, the people in power are actually, it's almost like they were tailor made to validate these radical critiques of the rich and powerful. So, from an anarchic lens, the scandal here reflects, you've got state building through betrayal and monopoly on violence. The Ikhwan were decentralized tribal warriors with their own autonomy, however brutal. Obviously, I'm not trying to praise them. I'm not saying they were valid either. But why did the Saudi royal family turn on them, or the burgeoning Saudi royal family? Well, Ibn Saud centralized power by wiping them out and monopolizing violence under the new state. So the silly billy anarchists out there would see this as the classic birth of the state, eliminating competing forms of authority to impose one sovereign. And it was the instrumental use of religion and ideology as well. Wahhabism is, or it was not a pure belief system for Ibn Saud, it was a tool. He used the Ikhwan's zealotry to expand, then discarded them when they became a liability. So, again, from a gooftastic anarchist perspective, this shows how rulers will co opt and weaponize belief systems, then suppress them once they threaten state authority. So, this is a crystal clear example of that. And that there was also colonial entanglement here. The fact that Britain armed Ibn Saud for this massacre highlights how imperial powers always back centralized authority over decentralized resistance, even when that resistance, it may have in some ways had just as much validity as the kingdom here. So this shows how states reinforce each other to maintain global hierarchies that are in cahoots with each other. At least strategic partnerships, of course, they might backstab each other at some point further down the line, but they are cynically, you know, linking up these global hierarchies to sort of form one unified front, one sort of unified global hierarchy. And you have the suppression of autonomous communities, in this case, the Ikhwan, despite their reactionary ideology, which, like I said, I don't support, but they were closer to an autonomous tribal federation than a centralized state. Their destruction meant the replacement of messy, plural, and often violent tribal life with a rigid top down monarchy, which was just as violent, or is just as violent, but it has more of a dignified appearance, you might say, because the king has a palace or the prince has a palace, and oh, look at that, they got all this shiny stuff. They're fancy, they're rich, they're well off. that's how monarchies are. And it does remind me of how right now, as I speak, Trump is sitting in a White House that he has transformed to look more like the I don't know, the pathetic lodgings of a tin pot dictator. He's got gold plated stuff all over in the White House, and he got rid of the Rose Garden to make things look just like crap. The Jack White of the White Stripes recently criticized criticized what Trump has done to the White House in terms of aesthetics. And sure enough, like Trump has just mangled the place. He's made it look stupid. It looks like a parody of what a wannabe monarch would do to a place. And from an anarchist standpoint, this is the suppression of this what uh, what Trump is doing is like the suppression of good taste, I suppose, too. But in terms of the ICWIN, the Saudi, the burgeoning Saudi Arabia government embarked on the suppression of decentralized autonomy in favor of statist domination and the appearance of being dignified and having law and order and stuff like that. So the bottom line here is that the biggest scandal of Ibn Saud's reign, the betrayal and massacre of the Ikhwan, was not just an episode of bloodshed, it was the defining moment when tribal decentralized militancy was crushed to consolidate the authoritarian, oil backed monarchy that still rules Saudi Arabia today. So, again, from the dumbass anarchic perspective, it is a textbook example of how states are born in violence, maintained by betrayal, and propped up by imperial powers.